Howdy y'all, and welcome to our Zeitgeist video on the English Civil War. So as we've already talked about, when Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, she doesn't have any children, and so who's going to become the next monarch of England is kind of a question mark. Who ends up taking the throne is James I. He's already King of Scotland, and so this is the beginning of what we think of as Great Britain, when it's not just England, but there's also Scotland. I feel bad because Wales always gets left out of this discussion, but Welsh rights and independence are the topic of a totally different video. So we have at this point, England and Scotland united under one crown under King James. And after James dies, after a fairly good reign, his son takes the throne in 1625, and that is King Charles. We're gonna look at him right here on his lovely white horse. James and Charles were different kinds of monarchs than the Tudors were before them. They were even more authoritarian, or what we call absolutist monarchs. They believed in the divine right theory of kingship. And this represents a big change from our medieval and even our earlier Tudor past. In medieval theories of kingship, a king receives his power from God, but he's obligated to act in his people's best interests. I know we've already talked about that, right? The king depends on the people, as well as the people depending on the king. In this medieval system, a king's power is not absolute. It is a parallel to the spiritual power that's held by the church. That spiritual power is greater than earthly power, and so a pope can always unseat a king if need be. Absolutist kings like James and Charles don't have that kind of check on their power. They see themselves as a power above the church, above parliament, and above the law. They require absolute obedience from their subjects in every single matter. And James was willing to kind of like negotiate and compromise with parliament, but Charles, not so much. And this is where some of our problems come, right? Because James and Charles were also financially extravagant rulers, both in terms of their personal expenses, like their dress. You can look at Charles here and see the way that he looks and the way he carries himself, right? He's got a lot of fancy stuff going on there. But also in terms of the way they run the country, there were a lot of expensive wars and stuff going on, and that also led to some problems. So one of the things before we get too caught up in Civil War that we need to talk about is the number one most important text of this time period, the King James Bible. This translation of the Bible into English was begun in 1604 and finished in 1611, and it's absolutely one of the most influential texts in the English language. It has a huge, wide-reaching impact on literary language as well as on religious matters and so forth, and it remained the authorized text of the Bible in England until the mid-20th century. So it exerts tons and tons of influence. So let's think a little bit, now that we've managed to think about this very central text, let's think about this lead up to the war that happens. So politically, what's going on here is that Parliament doesn't have like a standing schedule when they meet. They were called by the king when the king needs them. Kings could they couldn't really raise money without Parliament. So the members of Parliament were responsible not only for like voting and approving a tax, but also for like going back to their counties and collecting that money and bringing it back. Both James and Charles tried to do without Parliament's intervention as much as possible. They raised a lot of money in these kind of like dubious ways, like they would sell peerages. So like they would sell the rights to be a person of nobility, rather than calling Parliament to raise a tax and doing it the sort of legal way. In 1628, Parliament challenges Charles's royal prerogatives and they issue a petition on the rights of the subjects. Charles gets really cranky about this, dismisses Parliament, and doesn't call them again for more than 10 years. When he did finally have to recall them because he really, really needed money to repel this invading army that was coming in from Scotland in 1640, he was like, they pinned him down and they said, we won't talk about what you want to talk about until you address our grievances. So obviously we're not in a very friendly place between Charles and his Parliament. So let's talk a little bit about the religious factors that are leading up to this war, because I would say that those are even more important than the political factors at this point. You can see on the screen right now, we have two very different churches, and they symbolize for us the two sides of the religious debate that's going on in England at this time. it's super divided, right? We have Presbyterian reformers who want this sort of plainer, I'm going to try to zoom in on this church over here. They want this plainer, simpler form of worship. They don't want bishops. And on the other side, you have the bishops who want a lot more ritual, who want more ceremony returned to the church. And they also want it to be enforced uniformly between England and Scotland. And up till this point, Scotland has been fairly independent from the English church. So the Scots are not super excited about that. Charles himself at this point is suspected of being Catholic, even though he's of course nominally head of the English church, as all the monarchs have been before him. His wife, Henrietta Maria, or Henriette Marie, she's French and she is Catholic. So there's some suspicion there that the Presbyterians are like, oh, well, do we really trust Charles to be head of an English church because he has these Catholic tendencies? So we have war that breaks out in 1642 between the armies of the king and the armies of Parliament. And we have kind of two, as we had the two parallel churches, we have two parallel soldiers here. These soldiers are generally referred to as cavaliers on the king's side. And here's our nice portrait of a cavalier here. Looking all dapper in his ensemble here. And then we have on the side of Parliament, the Roundheads. And they're called Roundheads simply because they're not wearing wigs as many gentlemen do. They also favor, like their churches being plainer, they favor a plainer style of dress, a more simplistic, or simplistic is the wrong word, but a simpler way of conducting themselves, rather than the gentleman's way of wearing wigs and fancy clothes and lots of brocade and things like that. So we have these two sides of the army. I'm going to try to zoom back out so we can just kind of get a sense of this whole picture here. We'll go ahead and do that. So this war breaks out in 1642. By 1646, the army of the king, the royalists, has been defeated. And there are a few years of like a tentative truce where Parliament is mostly in power. But the biggest power right now is not actually Parliament, but the army. In 1648, we have uprisings of the royalists. Charles, who's been in captivity all this time, manages to escape. And in 1649, the army is just completely dominant. There have been these different mutinies that have been going on, but the army and Parliament side of things is completely victorious. Parliament is completely purged of anybody who doesn't support the agenda of the army, who's suspected to be on the side of the king. Charles is recaptured and he's tried by this new Parliament that's been completely built up on the side of the army. And so he's found guilty of treason. And in 1649, he is executed. As you can see, this fairly exciting, gruesome shot of his head getting chopped off here. This is huge. The king is executed in public for treason, right? So the king is declared to be against everything the country stands for, that he is in fact the rebel here and not anyone who opposes him. So this is a big, huge sea change in terms of the way that people think about stuff. England is declared a commonwealth instead of a kingdom at this point because there is no king. And so who we have in charge at this point is Parliament, but also this fellow down here, Oliver Cromwell. We're going to take a look at him. There he is. So Parliament at this point is just the House of Commons. The House of Lords has been abolished as useless and dangerous. And so Parliament is theoretically in charge of everything, but it's really Cromwell. He dissolves his first Parliament because it's just deeply unpopular. And then like the next one kind of proves to be a failure. And so he's just like, forget it. I'm going to name myself Lord Protector of England in 1653. And basically he rules alone, just as a king would have done before him. Oliver Cromwell is absolutely as controversial a figure as Charles was before him. Cromwell does some good things. He tries to keep the military and the government separate. He tries to introduce some measures of religious freedom, but he's also like just totally a despot, right? Like he's just as an authoritarian as the king that he executed. He dies in 1658. And strangely, instead of like electing somebody or something like that, no, Cromwell's son Richard steps in as Lord Protector. This sounds more and more like a monarchy, doesn't it? Richard, however, is like a totally lousy ruler, and there's absolute chaos at this point. So in 1660, a new parliament just kind of like declares itself, and they name Charles II king. He's been living abroad, and they say, come on over, we want you to be king of England, but we're going to really change what the power of a king means. Parliament maintains a lot of the powers that it retained in the Commonwealth, and the king is starting on this path of being much more of a symbolic figure rather than an actual figure at the head of the government. So that's my summary of basically what happens in the British Civil War. So it's a short time period, less than, it's about 20 years, but a lot happens for sure. So that's not all that's happening at this point, though, because we are also in our period of exploration and colonization. We have here the colony of Jamestown, named for James I. So he's the one who begins the process of establishing British colonies in North America. This is Jamestown in 1606. There are 12 colonies that have been established by 1688. By the time that James I's grandson, James II, passes away. We also have British colonies established in Bermuda and Barbados. And we have our first English ambassador to India, who's sent over to India in 1615. So again, those roots of the British Empire that are strong and deep a couple hundred years later are certainly established during this time period. We also have, this is really the first time in English history, the 17th century, that we see substantial emigration, not immigration, but people emigrating, leaving England. People are seeking better jobs and better lives, or they're seeking religious freedom, or something else. They make this fairly perilous voyage to the West Indies or to Virginia and Maryland, and then eventually to New England, as well as going to Ireland. This is our Mayflower down at the bottom here. So there's an awful lot going on in this time period, despite the Civil War or because of the Civil War. And so I hope you agree, it's been an interesting journey. And oh yeah, that's what I got. So cheers.